Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. In this session, we will look at the key concepts and terminology of the new group reading test, central for understanding what all the numbers mean and essential to help you to support your students. We will examine the reports available to you and how to utilize these to understand your data, with a case study as an example. Next, we will delve deeper into the data and provide some practical suggestions for analysis and use. Moving on, we will look at combination reports and how NGRT and Cat4 data can be used alongside each other to further understand your students. And finally, we will look at what to do next following this webinar and the further support available to you. So, let's first start with key concepts and terminology. Our new group reading test is a standardized termly reading assessment. The digital test is fully adaptive, which allows for a personalized experience for each pupil, ensuring that it is both accessible to those who may find reading more difficult, yet challenging for those who need to be stretched. The test has 3 sections. Every student sitting the digital version begins with the sentence completion. This is at an age-appropriate level. Depending on their performance in this part of the test, they will then progress onto either a passage comprehension section or to tasks relating to phonics. Every student completes 2 sections only. Typically, children are assessed in 2 areas: sentence completion and passage comprehension. The sentence completion section comes first, and this assesses a student's decoding skills, which is their ability to read a word by sounding out the phonemes within the word and contextualizing this within a sentence. This also includes some element of comprehension. If a student scores very low in this section, they will move on to the phonics tests, which I'll discuss later. Otherwise, after the sentence completion section, students will move on to the passage comprehension questions. This measures students' understanding of the written word in the form of more traditional comprehension exercises. The NGRT phonics tasks test 4 aspects of phonics, which are the foundations of successful reading: initial letters, sounds like, final letter sounds, and initial letter sounds. The standard age score, or SAS, is the most important piece of information derived from any standardized test. The SAS is based on the student's raw score, simply the number of marks gained, which has been adjusted for age and placed on a scale that makes a comparison with a nationally representative sample of students. The SAS is the fairest way to compare the performance of different students over time, across groups or between individuals. The average score is 100, and the scale runs from 69 to 141. Scores within 89 to 111 are regarded as being within the average brackets, where any score lower than 89 is below average, and any score higher than 111 can be categorized as above average. You will see reference to the national percentage rank, sometimes known as the percentile rank, or NPR. And the Stanines provide a broad overview of performance and is a scaled score from 1 to 9, with 1 being the lowest and 9 the highest. In the NGRT reports, you will see Stanines used in 2 ways: an overall Stanine, seen here, but additionally, you are provided with a Stanine for sentence completion and passage completion, seen here. You will also see an indicator score, seen here, which we will look at more closely now. Our indicators of future test performance are based on students' ages and may include Key Stage 2 scaled scores that reflect the results of Key Stage 2 SATs testing and run from 80 to 120, or indicators of potential performance at GCSE in English language, which would be reported to you in the form of a decimal number and relate to the 1 to 9 grading system. An indicative grade of 5.2, as an example, would be reflective of a student with a high chance of attaining a grade 5, whilst also likely to attain a grade 4, according to his or her performance in the test. Whilst an indicator of 5.7, say, would be reflective of someone whose test performance suggests that grade 6 could well be a possibility. Indicators can be a useful tool to support schools in targeted support, as well as collaborating with students to set targets and goals. You may find the linked video about the effective use of indicators helpful, especially if you are discussing them with parents. Triangulating other data with these indicators can also provide insights into how to overcome barriers that may impact potential outcomes. We are able to define the average performance of students at different ages, according to how our standardization sample performed in the new group reading test. In this simplified example, a 12-year-old girl gets a test score of 70. This places them in the bottom 10% of 12-year-olds in the national sample. Tracking across, we can see that this is the same as the average for a 9-year-old from the national sample. This 12-year-old is therefore given a reading age of 9. Reading age is another number you will find in your reports. Reading ages are often the source of some interesting conversations. Dr. Jessica Ricketts, Director of the Language and Reading Acquisition Research Lab at Royal Holloway University of London, describes the complexity of reading ages, noting they rest on the idea that there's a clear expectation for how well a child should be reading at any given age. In the interest of fairness, Dr. Ricketts suggests that, rather than view them as one level of reading, they are better to be considered at an expected range. Reading develops at different rates as we age, so there are larger differences in reading age at the bottom end of the scale. For this reason, we would recommend the use of SAS to compare performance of groups or to compare pupils over time. SAS is on an equal scale. In this next section, we will look at the range of reports available to you and how each will help you and your colleagues gain maximum benefits from the data provided. You'll notice that with our new group reading test, there is a suite of reports available to you. Group reports for teachers that collate results for a particular group or class. Individual reports for teachers that go into finer detail about implications for teaching and learning for single students. And parent-friendly versions of these reports, which provide more tailored advice for supporting students at home, are also available. Our Excel report is useful for importing NGRT assessment data into a management information system, or for completing additional analysis of data bespoke to the needs of individual schools. The progress reports allow you to compare students' results between each sitting, which facilitates the evaluation of interventions and curriculum planning. If you also make use of CAT4, our cognitive abilities test, you will find it useful to use the combination report, which compares students' underlying verbal reasoning ability with attainment as measured by NGRT. As I go through the reports, you'll begin to recognize that there is a cyclical nature to the NGRT. The reports at various levels highlight trends and help you to identify which students or cohorts need more focus and interventions. The reports help you determine what this might look like and how to go about looking at other data sources for information that can support your students and impact teaching and learning. Then, after a period of time, we are back at the beginning, retesting students and looking at how their reading ability has changed, whether the interventions in place are making an impact. Let's start with the group report for teachers and some approaches you may wish to take when beginning to look at your data. The group report for teachers can be used for all top-level data, whether that be a whole year group, a class, or an identified group of individuals. The reports can be run by surname or by SAS. You'll want to start by looking at the SAS for each student and note students whose reading ability is average for their age, above or below average. Finally, identify students with a discrepancy of 3 or more Stanines between their sentence completion, SC, and passage comprehension, PC scores. This table here shows the distribution of scores as well as overall Stanines. It allows you to compare this to standardization. You can see for this particular group, the average SAS score across the group was 92.7, with it being at 91.3 for males and 94.1 for females. So this group's average SAS was below the standardization average of 100. It is worth considering the following questions when analysing your own data. How do your students' scores compare to the national average? Are there differences between male and female students? Then it is important to think about the context. What are the possible reasons behind the scores? And what are the implications? So, for instance, if you have a large population of EAL students in your school, you may find that your students' scores fall below the average. And in order to ensure that they can access the curriculum and be appropriately challenged, language programs and reading interventions need to be considered. This graph provides a visual of the data in the table we just looked at. You may find one or the other easier to use depending on your preference. You can see the overall performance of the group by gender. Again, ask yourself the questions from the previous slide. Compare the bar chart to the standardization, represented by the pink line, and see if there are any differences between the scores of males and females. Again, consider the context and think about the reasons behind the scores. NGRT can be used termally to support planning, track progress, and to measure the impact of any interventions resulting from initial testing and other assessments you use. Using NGRT, starting with Form A, over time allows progress to be measured as students are tested with different but equivalent material at the second and third point of testing. This allows you to identify patterns of scores that represent significant progress or lack of progression that are set out clearly for easy access, allowing the success of interventions to be measured. 5 categories have been used to describe progress. Much lower than expected, lower than expected, expected, higher than expected, and much higher than expected. For any pupils in the much lower or lower categories, we recommend that you then run the individual reports to view their profile in detail. In this progress report examples, Form A, B, and C have been administered. With 3 data points, we have a start, mid, and finish point. Progress is measured between each point, so from start to mid, and then mid to finish. For Miriam, we can see that between the first 2 sittings, she made lower than expected progress. However, between the midpoint and finish point, she made expected progress. When looking at the progress reports, and specifically for students who are not making expected progress, you may want to ask yourself the following questions. Are there any contextual questions that may explain why these students have not made expected progress? If interventions have been put in place, how long for? Does this match with any other information you have about these students? Similarly to the group report, I would suggest looking towards the end of the report for headline information relating to the group. Knowing how the students have fared collectively may provide useful in terms of reading programs or interventions and give rise to important questions about the quality and level of texts that it would be appropriate to use with your students. The progress report also provides a comparative bar chart showing performance in the sittings against the national sample. A scatter plot is also generated. Students within the white area are making the expected level of progress. Those in the orange area below the expected progress, and green is expected or above. The scatter plot also shows this progress against reading ability and displays gender distribution of scores and progress. The pink dots are females and the blue dots are males. This can be a really useful visual to see overall how a particular group have progressed between the previous NGRT test they sat and the latest one. Schools often use NGRT more than once per year, and particularly with groups of students who have been part of an intervention group. This analysis can help to provide evidence of the success of such interventions, or whether a new approach needs to be considered. Now that we've looked at top-level cohort data and discussed how this can be used to identify individuals with results that need further investigating, we are now going to look at the individual report for teachers. This individual report can be run for individuals or multiple students at a time as a single PDF or individual files. We recommend that you run individual reports for students whose scores are 88 or below, or have a difference in the Stanines score for sentence completion and passage comprehension of 3 or more. You will be able to identify these students quickly through the group reports. Read the profile for the individual student and look at their individual scores for both sections of the test, noting any clear difficulties. Within the individual report, you will find the implications for teaching and learning section, which is personalized to the individual profile and suggests strategies to support the student in developing their reading skills. The individual report contains results in a similar format to those in the group report, as you can see on the screen. This individual has an overall SAS of 90, which is within the average range. However, we can see that there is a difference of 4 between the sentence completion and passage comprehension section Stanines. This would have been highlighted in the group report. The sentence completion score lies within the average range, which is Stanines 4 to 6, but the passage comprehension score is in the low range. This individual may appear to be a fluent reader, but may find understanding the words a challenge. We can further explore the individual report to find out exactly where their difficulties lie. The individual report provides an overview of student performance in the 2 sections of the test. Here is an example of the passage comprehension question analysis. This shows that of the 23 questions in the test, 6 of these were on inference and deduction, and that the pupil appeared to struggle with this section as well as others, as they only answered 1 out of 6 correctly. For students sitting the digital version, the number of questions posed will vary as the assessment is adaptive and responds to the perceived need for challenge or questions at a more basic level. This tells you that, for this individual, additional support with developing skills of inference and deduction, amongst other areas, may be beneficial. Ensuring that this information is carefully investigated and disseminated could lead to a more effective, strategic, personalized planning decisions and curriculum adaptations. For students whose testing pathway took them to the phonic-related tasks, you will be able to view a breakdown of their performance across 4 aspects, as listed here. This may help you to identify specific areas for focus as you help them to become successful readers. In the example on screen, we can see a student for whom some work around rhyme may be a priority area, given that the sounds like strand of the phonics section has the lowest score. The implications for teaching and learning section suggests specific strategies that can be used to support the student with reading skills identified as priorities for development. In this case, the individual report suggests what may be effective in tackling Elise's perceived challenges in using skills of inference and deduction. Where particularly low scores are seen, be them in particular sections of NGRT or across the whole assessment scores, our reading assessment flowchart will be a useful resource to turn to. This flowchart details possible next steps with regards to further screening, depending on the scores seen. For example, where low scores are seen primarily in the passage comprehension section, you may find using our YARC assessment, which is the York Assessment of Reading for Comprehension, a useful tool to explore further where the student really needs support with their comprehension skills. This information can be found on our website in the NGRT support section. Finally, we come to data correlation, which is using NGRT results alongside other data points to help build an even stronger picture of how your students are doing. We're going to be looking at NGRT and ability through the CAT4 data. Using CAT4, you will be able to compare attainment in NGRT with underlying verbal ability through our combination report. The NGRT scores are compared to the verbal battery scores from CAT4, and you will see similar categories to those in the progress reports. A reading discrepancy category highlights whether an individual's test performance matches, exceeds, or is not consistent with the reading attainment of children of a similar age and cognitive profile ability. For example, Joshua Brown has a high score in his CAT4 verbal battery, 130, but his NGRT SAS is 104. Given his underlying verbal skills, it is surprising that Joshua's score in his reading attainment test is not more consistent with his CAT4 verbal SAS. And with this sort of discrepancy, it is worth investigating why this might be. Remember, it is the comparative element that is important here. Discretely, these scores are not of concern. However, in comparison, they are of concern. Joshua may particularly benefit from a reading intervention program so as to support him in fulfilling his potential in this aspect of his schooling. A reading profile of under or overachievement is produced for the combination report. Students located within the white band are working at an expected level when comparing their NGRT SAS and their verbal CAT4 score. Students in the blue band are working higher and much higher than expected, and those in the green are working at a lower or much lower than expected level. This allows schools to identify under and overachievers and inform future planning and intervention. Finally, your next steps, our recommended actions following this webinar, and where you can find further support on our website and training hub. Let's look at the testing cycle again. Use the group report for teachers to look for trends in the data, comparing groups against each other as well as against the standardization. Start with running the group report and identifying students who have below average scores. Also look at sentence completion and passage comprehension Stanines and highlight any students who have a difference of 3 or more. Next, use the individual report to explore further the specific areas for these students so you can begin to tailor support and utilize the implications for teaching and learning sections for ideas. Now, with information about your cohorts and individual students, you can begin to build intervention strategies and other types of follow-up. Finally, use the reading diagnostic pathway to determine further screening for individuals if necessary. Finally, we offer a range of further support. Here you can see the link to our support guides for NGRT. These are all held on our support site. We also have a range of training available to you. Most of our training is self-guided, and you can find all the information you need, including signing up to sessions on our training site. Before we finish, I'm just going to check with my colleague Anne whether any questions have come through during the webinar, either in the chat box or previously by email. Anne.
Hi, thanks for that. That was really great to listen to. we've had a few come through. We had these come through on the email this morning, and one of them, which is slightly controversial, which is in terms of how do you talk to parents specifically about reading ages? So this isn't the easiest topic for people to get their head around anyway, but in terms of parents, yeah, it'd be great if you could just sort of give some advice about that.
It's a good question, and it is one that we do get asked a lot. I think it has to be school dependent. Lots of schools do find it useful, whilst other schools prefer to use the more descriptive narrative commentaries. It really does depend on your individual context and preferences. Like I say, we do have plenty of schools who find it useful to share this information or other data from the NGRT. And similarly, we do have plenty of schools who prefer to focus on giving that specific descriptive feedback to parents about reading rather than SAS scores.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. The next one we've got is, how can I use NGRT to identify students for reading intervention and then measure the impact of this? So you touched on this in terms of looking at the different points and then how NGRT works in relationship to those. But yeah, if you could expand a bit on that in terms of the reading interventions and then measuring the impact, that'd be great.
Sure. So again, it's a good question. And again, we do find a lot of schools use NGRT to screen all students in the first term of the year to obtain that baseline understanding of students' reading ability, as well as any barriers to accessing the curriculum. As I've touched upon in the presentation, the screening can identify weaker readers for whom an intervention can be put in place. I mean, your individual school's criteria of selection for students most in need of intervention, it will depend on your own context and distribution of data. But as I said earlier, we would encourage you to consider the SAS or Stanines to identify those priority students.
Okay, great. Sounds good. I mean, it's always worth remembering that it's not just the reading age you want people to be focusing on, but that SAS score is really key.
Yeah, absolutely.
And using it in relationship to what your standards are for your school and in your cohorts is always really important to remember. That's it so far for the questions. Of course, if you have any further questions, feel free to email them even after the webinar is over, and we'll of course give you our response. But other than that, that's it. So Finn, back to you.
Anne. Thank you, Anne. Well, again, I mean, that's all from me now. All that leaves is me to say thank you so much again for joining us this afternoon. And like Anne says, if you do have any further questions at all, do get in touch. You can see the email address on the screen there. And I hope you have a lovely rest of the afternoon. And thank you again for joining us.